So I'm extremely privileged and honored tonight to introduce Paul. Paul is currently the head of web services strategy at Amazon Web Services, which is the preferred cloud computing platform for millions of businesses. Paul and his team drive global expansion plans and optimize the supply and demand for this huge business. Paul is an adventurous individual, having ran marathons on all 7 continents and visited over 85 countries. Paul is an extremely talented and accomplished tech individual, where he has held multiple leadership positions and even founded his own business, which is called Navigo Global. So if all of you would just give me a hand and welcome Paul to the stage.
Thanks. Okay. Yeah. No worries. Good evening. So I'll tell you how I got from 7 continent marathons to this later on in the presentation. But I wanted to say thank you very much to Mike, to Dean Anderson for the opportunity to speak with you tonight. Here, this is an honor, and this is a very, very unique program. You guys should consider yourselves honored to be in a program like this. This is super unique and a very, very cool program. So I appreciate the opportunity. I'm a corporate entrepreneur, so I've gone back and forth from technology companies to consulting firms several different times throughout my career. And I'll walk you through that tonight. My last move to Seattle, I think, was my 23rd move in the last 30 years, including several different continents internationally. But overall, there's been this golden thread of something called creative destruction through my career. And so that's going to be the basis upon which the presentation is going to hinge tonight. So I work in strategy, and I think creative destruction is fundamental about strategy. It's about identifying it, it's about driving it, it's about riding it, it's about accelerating it. So regardless of what you guys do over the course of your career, whether you decide to be an entrepreneur, or you want to be a farmer, or you go into philanthropy, or you work in a Fortune 500 company, creative destruction will have a huge impact on your life. And so that's going to be the basis of discussion. And hopefully you find a nugget of value out of this that you can apply to your life and your career. So let me start by telling you a little bit about me. So I grew up in Michigan, the youngest of 9 children, 5 girls and 4 boys. I have 3 children, 2 boys that are in college and a daughter that's a freshman in high school. And Michelle is here with me tonight, and perhaps she should be giving the presentation. She's a true entrepreneur, having started a successful interior design and home staging business in Seattle. I offer her to give the presentation, but she declined, so I'm going to continue. So my dad was a real entrepreneurial role model for me. And so he lied about his age, and he quit high school and joined the Navy because he wanted to be a deep sea diver. And so he went into the Navy and he went through diving school, and after that he was on the submarines, and he was on a submarine going through the Caribbean to go through the Panama Canal to go to Pearl Harbor when Pearl Harbor was bombed. And so he spent the next 3 years in the Pacific on submarines. After the war was over with, he went back to Michigan and started the first marine construction company in Michigan. Over time, there was a gentleman that owed him $400 and couldn't pay, but he did have a boat that was sunk. And so my father took that boat and raised it and started 2 steel distribution companies with that. So by the time that I was born, my father was about 45 years old. He had sold out of all 3 of these companies, and I saw the upside of being an entrepreneur. My father also introduced me to a lot of adventure. And so when I was 4 years old, he left Michigan and went to eastern Turkey and went and climbed Mount Ararat to look for Noah's Ark. While he was on Mount Ararat, he was struck by lightning and paralyzed for a while. Fortunately, he ultimately came down safely with everybody else. When I was 8 years old, my father and my parents took me out of school for 6 months along with 4 of my brothers and sisters. And we sailed from Muskegon, Michigan, all the way through the Great Lakes, down the Erie Barge Canal in 37 locks, then down the entire east coast of the U.S. to the Bahamas. And so I can still remember sitting there on the deck of our 45-foot motor sailor and holding onto the mast with this arm and my cat Pearl in this arm as a 55-foot sperm whale grazed our boat and turned and saw its eye and tail went up after it got past our boat and slapped the water. And so it was an incredible experience. A little bit later, I was in high school, and my father started to develop a large piece of property in our hometown. And things started to turn sour, and he lost a lot of money, and he ended up going bankrupt. So I saw the downside of being an entrepreneur. So that's lesson number one, is entrepreneur or not, protect the downside, and the upside will take care of itself. And oftentimes, downsides happen a heck of a lot faster than the upside journey. So a very important point that I was able to witness, and you can see time and time again from entrepreneurs across the world. So what is creative destruction? So this is a very, very old economic term. And if there's any cool economic terms, I think this is actually one of them. So this came from 1942. A gentleman named Joseph Schumpeter started creative destruction. And I think it's a very cool, just in terms of the way he describes it. So capitalism is the process of industrial mutation that incessantly revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one, incessantly creating a new one. The process of creative destruction is the essential fact about capitalism. And he gets really flowery and says it requires the perennial gale of creative destruction as capitalism. But at the bottom, in his vision of capitalism, innovative entry by entrepreneurs was the disruptive force that sustains economic growth. How much more applicable to this class could creative destruction be? So, I'm going to tell you about my industry experience. I've worked primarily within telecom, and this is not going to be a technical discussion. But most of my work has been around the middle of this graphic, in and around the network. Fiber optic cables that supports the internet and mobile communications and data traffic around the world. So I'm going to talk to you about three things. Number one, how I learned about telecom and I saw creative destruction at work. How I tried to transform the telecom industry from the inside and stayed companies that really fought against it. And then how I tried to accelerate creative destruction by leaving the telecommunications industry and how I'm seeing it happen in the wider industry today. So, learning about creative destruction, I started my career at Motorola. How many of you have even heard of Motorola? Good. So when I graduated from college in 1990, Motorola was the preeminent technology manufacturer at the time. They were leading in two-way radios around the world. They invented cellular phones. In 1990, they had well over 50% market share for cellular phones globally, split with Nokia. So I learned about telecom. I worked in finance. I was able to work in international strategic marketing and do long-term projects to increase sales in Poland, Mexico, Brazil, Thailand, Indonesia, China. And it was a great company. I also learned about Six Sigma process improvement methodology. And Motorola also started this. And I was able to use this to solve a customer billing problem. And they had this thing called a total customer satisfaction competition internally, where you went through national and regional and global competitions, and we ended up winning a corporate gold medal out of 3,000 other teams within Motorola. But I have used these principles in every single job I've had since. And if you ever get the chance to learn Six Sigma process improvement methodology, do it, because it is hugely valuable no matter what you do in life. Now, I said Motorola had over a 50% market share in cellular phones. By 2000, when this chart starts, because I couldn't find one that was any longer, they were down to 15%, and by 2010, they were down to 1% when they sold their cellular phone division to Google. Now, there's an awful lot of articles written about why Motorola failed, but people and corporations need to innovate, and they clearly did not do that. I wanted to use the consulting experience that I gained at Motorola to leap into consulting. And so I went and interviewed with a bunch of firms and ultimately ended up with Coopers & Lybrand's telecom consulting unit, which was one of the best telecom consulting firms at the time. And within 2 months of joining, I was off to Taiwan to put together a end-to-end financial model for one of the first mobile providers in Taiwan. And I ended up not staying at that company very long, where I went and joined a company called Level 3 Communications, where Level 3 was one of the best funded startups of all times, $14 billion. I was number 70, and I was the first international hire. And I started in Chicago, and then I moved to Belgium and opened up all of their offices in Europe, and moved to London to head up business development before moving with them back to Boulder, Colorado. They had an aggressive goal where they were going to build the world's largest internet backbone. And largely, we succeeded. And this is conduits that are in the ground and fiber optic cables and electronics on the ends. And Level 3 was an absolutely fantastic experience where I was able to learn and participate functionally in sales and M&A and marketing and product management and finance and IT and operations. And so it was a hugely important part of my career where I kind of learned in dog years. This chart is not drawn to scale. When I joined Level 3 in December of 1997, it was pre-IPO. 6 months after I joined, we went through an initial public offering, and the stock went from $0 to $132 a share. At 29 years old, I had $6 million in stock. I bought like the nicest house that I would have never expected, and was fabulous. You know, life was good. A year later, our stock was down to $2. This was called the internet bubble. And I'm sure that over the course of your lifetime, you too will have the opportunity to go through a learning experience like this. Like it or not, you will go through a learning experience like this. And so I left finally in 2006. In 2017, Level 3 was sold to CenturyLink for $34 billion, and Level 3, almost like Motorola, no longer exists today. So I told you a little bit about how I learned about telecom. This is lesson number 2, that the value of a job or a career is about experience and satisfaction. It is certainly not how much money you make for it. Money is a horrible, vapid measure of success and worth. And that's difficult to measure on a day-to-day basis or keep in the forefront of your mind. But ask anybody who's been in a career for 30 years, and they will tell you this. And money is a horrible measure of success, and it's often fleeting, going back to lesson number 1. So I left Level 3. My mother had Alzheimer's, and so I wanted my kids to spend some time with her. And so I moved back to Michigan. And this is where I became a classical entrepreneur. And I started a consulting company with some friends from Level 3, and we had a great time. So we looked and we worked with private equity companies and venture capital firms. This is actually one in Salt Lake City that I worked with, and we mapped the entire portfolio of their investments across the 7 layers of the telecom network stack to show them where they might be overweighted in one particular area. We also worked with telecom startups. We had great fun, and we actually made more money than Level 3. And it was a really, really good time in life and allowed me to be back in Michigan with my parents. And I think that's one thing that you're going to see with creative destruction. You'll work for more companies over the course of your life. You'll have periods of time where you're going to have alternative unemployment or no employment, and you're going to have to figure it out by yourself. But that's one thing like a class like this will give you, is some tools to use to make your own way through these periods of alternative employment. I went from that to, I had some friends from Level 3 once again. You know, the point that Mike Lauser showed at the beginning about networking being the success. Just through my presentation already, you've heard me speak several times about friends from Level 3. That diaspora of people who left that company that I still stay in contact with today is absolutely incredible. And they help you along the way. So I went from, I was still in Michigan. I had a friend that went to London, and he was working for British Telecom, heading up the networks for British Telecom in London. Another friend was working for Accenture, and they were working together. And they asked me to come over to London to implement statistical process controls, or the Lean Six Sigma metrics, into British Telecom's network. Remember those same Six Sigma processes that I told you about from Motorola? That's exactly what I was implementing within British Telecom's network organization. So I went to London, and I spent about 6 months there traveling back and forth to Michigan as I worked for Accenture, leading this team into British Telecom. And ultimately was hired by Accenture, moved my family back to London in December of 2007, joining Accenture as a lead strategy consulting partner for their communication business in the UK and across Europe. And we worked with telecom companies all over the world and was able to lead really cool projects in terms of M&A, process improvement, product development. Was able to do a project for Her Highness of Qatar and the Qatar Foundation, putting together a website across the Middle East to promote free speech and democracy across the Middle East. And really cool different projects. This is one that I did for the Chief Operating Officer of AT&T. So this is 2010, and they were going from 3G to 4G technology. But in order to do that, they had to upgrade all of the networks from copper or Ethernet to fiber optic cables. And so they had to upgrade 11,787 cellular towers or base stations all over the US. And a year into the program, because of problems with their infrastructure and how they were building their network and service delivery with how they were activating it, they had only activated 489 sites. So they were a year behind schedule. So over the next 18 months, I devoted my life to this project. I commuted every week from London to Dallas, an 11-hour flight each way. I flew over 500,000 miles in 1 year. I was a top customer for British Airlines. And it wasn't that fun. But we were ultimately able to complete this project successfully. We called this the kidney stone chart because that's how painful it was for AT&T. That time in life was especially painful because one of the weekends while I was home in London, I was reading The Economist, and I saw something from the University of Oxford that said they were starting a new master's program in strategy and innovation, and I thought, wow, that would be pretty cool. And so I applied and was accepted, and I put together a one-page paper that I gave to my boss at Accenture as far as why I thought they should pay for it and invest in me, and surprisingly, they agreed. So I'm jumped ahead. But I think that's one lesson here is to appropriately, professionally, and thoughtfully ask and acknowledge and overcome your fear. And all people can say is no. And more than often, people will surprise you. And I try to teach my kids this, and I think this is so basic. But so much of our day-to-day life is around fear, and trying to identify that and overcome it, and just ask. And oftentimes people will surprise you. I was able to get my master's program, my MBA, and this master's in strategy paid for by the companies I was working for just because I asked. So while I was at Oxford, actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to this slide. Because while I was at Oxford, this is the slide that made the biggest impact on me. It's not that complex, but this shows the average lifespan of a company in the S&P 500. Going back to the 1950s, it was over 60 years. By today, it's 14 years. And in the next decade, it's actually forecast to be less than 10. If you look at Fortune 500 companies, it's the same thing. In 1955 to 2014, 88% of all companies in the Fortune 500 are gone. Gone. And this is only accelerating. So this is the best slide that I can show you on creative destruction. You know, Jeff Bezos publicly, when he did the 2018 results last month, said, I think someday Amazon's going to go bankrupt. Who in this room could ever imagine Jeff Bezos saying that about Amazon? But this is the reason why. People and companies need to innovate. So while I was at Oxford, I had to write a thesis. And I wrote my thesis on the dynamic nature of the communications industry and why companies need to change and where is value going. So I know not all of you are business majors, but the first attempt I did in proprietary research on this was I looked at EBITDA, which stands for earnings before taxes, interest, and depreciation, and it's a measure of how profitable are companies. And when you looked at this across the entire communications value chain, you see that content owners' growth rates over the past decade are up 136%. Aggregation platforms are pretty flat. Device and equipment manufacturers are up 131%. Retailers are down, mobile networks are down, wireline network operators are up. It doesn't really tell that consistent of a story. And sometimes creative destruction is not that easily recognizable. But then I looked at something called return on invested capital. And if you look at it this way, return on invested capital is how well does a company use their capital to invest in profitable investments? How well are they investing in the future? This tells a very, very different story. Here, you see that content owners are up 36%, aggregation platforms up 127%, device and equipment manufacturers up 67%, but retailers are down. But look at mobile network operators, down 32%, wireline network operators down 23%, and this is not sustainable. This is the basis of why you don't have 5G technology today, is because operators can't afford it. And so armed with this information in 2011, I was in the perfect place as a strategy consultant or partner at Accenture to go and educate the telecom operators with what was wrong. With this information, surely they would change. And so this next section, we just talked about how I learned about telecom. This next section is how I spent the next 5 years trying to transform the telecom industry from within and met companies that were very, very resistant to change. And then we'll talk about how I tried to accelerate the industry from the outside. So 4 attempts over 5 years. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. So the first attempt was I tried to get a bunch of industry participants together in London to establish an e-bonding platform around network-related investments to create huge efficiencies around areas of telecom where these guys spent billions and billions of dollars very inefficiently. And so I invited participants from the top 10 telecom firms from around the world to London for a 2-day workshop to talk about this. And we focused on very specific part of the telecommunication process so that we were very judicious in our use of time. And I was able to show them how it was very inefficient for operators to have a one-to-one relationship with operators all over the world versus having this electronically bonded platform. And you can look at industries and you can see where there's analogies with other industries. So within the airline industry, there's something called Sabre that was started with American Airlines and IBM back in the 1970s. And Sabre was doing ticketing. And it was actually rolled out of American Airlines when it became worth more than American Airlines itself in 2000. And it processes over $120 billion of transactions in travel today, 1.1 trillion messages, hugely successful, and Amadeus does the same thing in Europe. Or you can look at the banking industry where 153 banks got together in the 1970s to implement SWIFT on cross-border transactions. And that's in over 200 countries today and 11,000 financial institutions. Or you can look at the credit card industry where First Data does the same thing for the credit card industry and has over 6 million merchants and does 45% of all credit card transactions in the US. But you look in telecom, absolutely nothing. And all our attempts to drive change in this area didn't go anywhere. So I started running. And I grew up in a family where drinking and smoking were really normal. And by this time, I was smoking about 2 packs a day. And so I quit both on March 9th of 2012, and I started running for both mental and physical health. And so I ran my first marathon in Fort Collins, Colorado in May of 2015, and I didn't die like I was expecting. And so I thought, well, this is pretty cool. I'm going to combine this with travel. And so my second marathon was in Paris in 2016, and I combined that with a trip to Morocco beforehand. But one thing that's advisable is not to ride a camel into the Sahara Desert the week before a marathon, in case you have any ideas to do something like that. But fantastic experiences. But I kept trying to drive this change in telecom at the same time. So my second attempt was to map the entire database of buildings in the US that all of these telecom operators have as legacy network buildings, because turning them off would reap a lot of rewards. And we were able to map over 23,000 buildings across the US and show about $20 to $25 billion of improvements. And my team and I were able to map out this entire process and show it to operators. This is the exact steps that you would go through to be able to create this value and to turn off all of this old telecom equipment. And we even mapped it to the top 6 operators in the US and said, here's 16,000 buildings representing over $16.5 billion. Go get it. And the operators did nothing. So I kept running. So my third marathon was in Victoria Falls, Zimbabwe. And that was a really cool one where I took about 6 weeks, and I worked US hours while I traveled through about 9 different African countries. And I was able to go play with cheetahs and climb Mount Kilimanjaro and do great white shark dives and a lot of really cool things that were on my bucket list. And my fourth marathon was in Tokyo in 2017, and after that, I was able to go skiing in the North Island of Hokkaido. Any skiers or snowboarders here? Well, if you guys like powder, go to Hokkaido, because it's supposed to be even better than Utah. And lift tickets are a third of the US. So great skiing. If you take nothing from the presentation, Hokkaido lift tickets being a third of the US, that might be the main takeaway from this discussion. But here's the fourth one. It's live intentionally. Write down a bucket list and goals for your life over 1, 3, 5, and 10 years by faith, family, spouse or partner, children, recreation, travel. And you'll be amazed, absolutely amazed at what is possible. But live intentionally. My third attempt was to create a more robust, all-encompassing program for these telecom operators. So it was around products and customers and network. And Accenture even gave me a few $1 million, and we went out and developed this Accenture Intelligent Migration Suite of online tools to help telecom operators do this transformation even faster, and they did nothing. So I kept running. So the fifth marathon was in Machu Picchu, and this is purported to be the most difficult marathon in the world, where you actually run up 11,000 feet and down 11,000 feet over the course of 26.2 miles. And this is where I actually met Mike Clauser and his speedy wife, Mary, who actually won the female division. And that's one of the best things about destination running, is the people that you meet along the way. It's absolutely phenomenal. And the sixth marathon was in Queenstown, New Zealand. And if you ever get a chance, the South Island of New Zealand is absolutely an incredible place to visit. But I had one last try at changing telecom. So if the operators wouldn't try, again, strategy, you're always trying to take a different spin across the chessboard and try a different move. So this one, I was going to work with private equity companies and do an inside-out play or an outside-in play, and work with players in North America and do a large consolidation play. And we were going to develop a transactional company that was worth $3 billion and a network company that was worth $1 billion. And we even mapped it out year by year. This is the step you would need to take each year, and nothing happened. because consolidation plays are really, really hard, even when you have lots of capital, some of the best private equity companies in the country, and great minds. Consolidation plays are really difficult to do. So I was done with telecom. However, I kept running. So my 7th marathon was in Antarctica 1 year ago. And we took a boat from Ushuaia, Argentina, sailing down the Drake Passage to the Shetland Islands in Antarctica, and ran there, and ran from the Chilean research station through the Chinese station and the Russian research station. And it was absolutely incredible. And if you ever get a chance to go to Antarctica, put that on your bucket list and go. We were able to literally touch humpback whales from zodiacs, and the zodiac I was in got bit by a leopard seal and deflated, and we were able to go swimming and see penguins. Not for long. You don't swim for very long there, but got to jump in and go swimming. And it was just an absolutely incredible experience. And 1 month later, the 8th marathon was in the Boston Marathon, which I had qualified for. And the 7th continent was also my 7th continent marathon, which I think only 700 people have done thus far to date. And that was my 85th or 86th country. So Boston was 1 month later, and this knee, I blew out the meniscus in mile 8. But I never stopped running, which was the problem. And so I finished the whole marathon painfully, but that was part of the problem. This is the second surgery to try to correct this. And so hopefully I will be walking again shortly, and I'm signed up for the Berlin Marathon in September and New York in November. So fingers crossed. Yeah. Thank you. So I've talked about how I went through and learned about telecom, and we talked about how I tried to transform telecom from within, and now we're going to talk about how I tried to accelerate telecom from the outside. So I wanted to join one of the websites or Google, and I ended up joining Amazon Web Services, the cloud computing portion of Amazon, in July of 2017. Now, telcos are no longer in the cloud computing race. They have lost, and I'll show you a variety of reasons why. Amazon Web Services was first. Back in 2016, on the bottom left, they had 40% of the global cloud computing market. Microsoft, Google, and IBM had 20% combined, and the next 10 players after that had another 20%. So Amazon Web Services is larger than the next 13 competitors combined, is their market lead. If you look on the right-hand side, this is the public information as part of our fourth quarter 2018 press release. We're the fastest growing IT company in history, faster than Salesforce, Oracle, Microsoft, anyone. At $25 billion today, sales in the fourth quarter grew 45%. Operating income went up 61%. And it's an absolutely incredible place to work. So you may wonder, how did Amazon Retail get into Amazon Cloud Computing? And after a decade of operating this huge platform at scale on the Amazon.com side of the business, they realized that they had a lot of capabilities that they could extend into another business for businesses and developers. And so they started Amazon Web Services. And the driver there is not really cost. A lot of people think it's all about cost. It's really about agility and innovation. Because before this, for engineers to turn up services, it would take them 6 to 12 to 18 months to turn up new products and services. With cloud computing, entrepreneurs is great for entrepreneurs because you can turn up new products and services in minutes globally. And so you have huge speed to market. And I'll show you how that takes place. So I wanted to be with an innovative company that's driving change, and I'll show you how this is driving change to the telecommunications industry and others from the outside. So AWS customers are in every market. Minerals, healthcare, banking, communications, technology, finance, and huge public service market as well. We're global. Publicly, we have 18 regions, and in each region, we normally try to have 3 different availability zones where our data centers are, because you need network resiliency and redundancy, and I'll show you a little bit more of that later. And then we have 132 edge locations where we push information out to the edge. And each of these locations have literally hundreds of thousands or more servers that are located within them. And this is a big part of my business. So I sit in infrastructure planning. And across AWS infrastructure, we have global expansion that I work with closely. I'll tell you a little bit more about what I do in planning, supply chain and procurement, planning, hardware, global data centers, operating the data centers, and networking them together is a huge part. So within long-range planning, I have 2 different parts. One is region planning, where we plan and forecast and balance supply and demand 2 to 10 years out. We do all of the forecasting 2 years to 5 years, and we forecast in power, because we don't know what servers or generations are going to be 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road. The only thing I know is how much power we might use. And so the unit of measure that I use is 10 kilowatt equivalent racks. That's power. And then I have another team that has long-range analytics. And they build tools, and they deep dive data, and they pressure test and scenario pressure test our plans. And so this team is made up of business intelligence engineers, data engineers, and I have PhD economists on the team. But I think the job that I have is actually one of the coolest long-range supply and demand optimization problems facing business today. And I'll give you an example. So let's say that you're the head of operations for Salt Lake City Airport or New York Airport, and you know how many planes you need to have and how many people are flying tomorrow that you can plan for, and you have that many TSA agents and pilots and stewardesses all lined up. But what if everybody in Salt Lake went to the airport tomorrow and wanted to fly? Or everybody in New York went to the airport tomorrow and wanted to fly? And you need to have all of the physical planes on the ground and ticketing agents and TSA agents and stewardesses and pilots all lined up for that period of unknown. So how many of you play Fortnite? Really? Come on. So that's exactly what Fortnite does to my business. Because gaming customers can spike and use all of the compute capacity that Fortune 500 or 1,000 firms use overnight. And so gaming presents a really difficult problem, but I have to plan for and have all of that infrastructure in place even when that's not forecast. And so that's really, really difficult, and it can be really expensive. So that's the type of challenges that we have to plan through. So the balance of this presentation, I'm not going to talk about Amazon specifically. However, my friends from Accenture Strategy, again, going back to the networking, have allowed me to use these slides with their permission, and we're going to talk about the software and the platform industry and players like Amazon and Google and Facebook and how they're changing and driving creative destruction in industry today. So I don't know how many of you read The Economist. These are covers just going back to 2015 and 2016. But the platform companies are reshaping the global economy and how we work and live day by day by day. And we'll go through some of those things today. One last lesson is keep learning and be coachable. Even when you don't need the credit hours to take a really cool class like this, keep learning and be coachable. And how are you going to do that once you leave and do that over the course of your life? One of the ways that I do that is through reading The Economist. I think it's the most intelligent English source of unbiased news around business and personal issues that is out there today. And so I highly recommend it, and I'll make a lot of plugs for it here in the presentation. Key dimensions of software and platform companies. They are born digital and they're disrupting. Platform-based. They serve hundreds of millions to billions of users And a key part is a network effect of scaling. And it's this digital ecosystem. So what makes these companies successful? This is one of my favorite slides. And this slide grew out of my work at Oxford and how I was looking at the communications industry. Look at the upper part of this slide, and it shows platform companies having hundreds of millions or billions of users at really low average revenue per user. It's a really unique business model. Now look at the bottom, where you have telecom companies that may have 100 million customers, but they're regional. They're protected by regulations and high barriers to entry. It's really costly to build a nationwide fiber optic network or to rent or lease a nationwide mobile network. And so there's huge barriers to entry in telecom, and you see the results in the amount that we pay in telecom charges over the course of a year. That doesn't feel very good. Also, think about your customer experience. With the top customers or the top companies, when is the last time, if ever, that you've had to interact with one of their customer service individuals? Has anybody ever had to contact a customer service for the companies up on top? Not a single hand. Now think about the companies on the bottom. Who wants to talk to anybody in customer service from the companies on the bottom, right? It's like the most horrid customer service you can experience. And so a really unique point. Now, here's the same companies up on top a year later. And I just want to point out Amazon going from $296 per user to $417. How many of you are Prime customers? Thank you very much. That is the effect of something called Prime. So why is the network effect so important? Because it's about dominating a particular industry. And you see this really strongly in Google. 90% coverage in their search. Facebook, 51% of their online population. Microsoft, 83% of operating systems. Look at this, in 2016, Apple had 91% of all smartphone profits if you reverse engineer the way that they developed the iPhones. 91%. Amazon, 41% of commerce. So they dominate their core business market. And this translates into highly competitive pricing. This is the cloud computing aspects of Google, Amazon, and Microsoft. And you'll see over the past 6 years, from 2010 to 16, 400% price declines. That's intentional. That is bringing products and services to customers at ever-improving costs. Wouldn't you love to have a 400% price decline from your mobile provider? Not going to happen, right? But this type of innovation is also happening in other areas of platform providers. So let's take device and clouds. If you look at platform providers over time, 2008 to 2016, they start working through indirect competition. I'll just take phones. Microsoft dipped their toes in developing phone relationships through a partnership with Ericsson in 2010. Remember when Motorola went bankrupt in 2011, who bought their mobile phone operating unit? It was Google, and then they moved the Android operating system into the Motorola phone. And so they start through indirect competition and then go direct by purchasing or acquiring the technology. And you see this intensity of communications or competition even more prevalent in the cloud computing aspects of these companies. And so, is this just a US phenomenon? No, it's not. So this is happening globally. So I'm going to name off some companies here. I just want you to raise your hands if you've heard of these companies. Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, Rakuten, Nespers. So you haven't even heard of these companies yet, but you will. And these companies will change the way that you work and live in the future. So I don't know if you've actually connected the dots of how I took you from telecom, kind of in the early part of my career, through clouds and networks and devices. But the point is that they are inextricably linked. You cannot do one without the other. And the devices that you use every day, whether they're PCs or mobile phones or cars or TVs, are completely linked together, particularly if any information is in the cloud with cloud and network and devices. And this is only going to increase in the future. So the reason that's driving this is engineering intensity. And cloud computing is contributing heavily to this, along with open source and a lot of other things that I don't even purport to understand. So Google, at 1.3 billion users, had 15,000 engineers, or 87,000 engineers to one. You look at WhatsApp, who's launched later, completely based upon cloud computing, and back in 2013, 450 million users, 32 engineers, 14 million users to one engineer. In 2016, 3 years later, WhatsApp had 1 billion users and 57 engineers. 18 million users to one engineer. Now compare and contrast that with Verizon, who has 112 million users, 20,000 engineers, 5,600 users to one engineer, 18 million to 5,600. That's the difference in engineering and intensity, in innovation and agility that these players have versus legacy telecom providers. And that's what's driving this disruption in different parts of the industries today. So going back to telecom and how cloud computing is driving telecom, the upper left-hand chart is the growth in total telecom infrastructure for cloud computing from 2016 to 2021. So I don't even know what a zettabyte is. It's really, really big. But in 2021, data centers are going to have 20.6 zettabytes. To put that into perspective, all other telecom traffic in the world is going to be 3.3. So data centers are 6 times larger than all other telecom traffic combined. And the reason is that 70% of all of this traffic is staying within a data center, and only 14% of it actually goes from a data center to a user. And on the bottom left, Facebook, Amazon, Google have grown their telecom infrastructure 14-fold over the last few years. And I like this statistic. If you look at these players, who's driving bandwidth use? Netflix uses 15% of the world's total telecom bandwidth. In the US, that's 19%. And in peak periods of time, that can jump as high as 40% for Netflix. So Netflix is an incredible company devouring bandwidth around the world. Now, why do I keep talking about telecom? It's because any time that you have a platform or a cloud compute or a device that's linked to a cloud, it requires bandwidth. Accenture does this survey every year all over the world, and they ask customers, what's your experience with your internet connectivity daily or weekly, and how often do you experience poor connectivity? And what I find interesting is the developed countries are down at the bottom end of this scale, and developing countries are up towards the left-hand side of the scale, and it's a bit counterintuitive. But I think it shows our customer preferences, and that over time, we want and we have greater expectations for network bandwidth over time, that we want more and more and more. Even though we have good networks here in the US, we still want better bandwidth all the time. And the telecom firms continue to disappoint in delivering this. So platform companies are doing it themselves. Now, you may be familiar with, how many of you have heard of Google Fiber here in Salt Lake City? You may be less aware of Google Loom, where they're actually floating balloons 20 kilometers above the earth, and they're using software algorithms to change the levels of the balloons within the stratosphere to establish a mesh network and to drive internet connectivity completely outside of the telecom firms. And this has been tested in New Zealand, California, and Brazil. And how disruptive is that? And that's the type of disruption that these companies are driving within telecom today, because it's critically important. So that innovation is coming in clouds, it's coming in networks, it's coming in devices, whether it's environmental and motion sensors that power my sleep apps, whether it's the camera, vision, proximity sensors that's coming that have disrupted the entire photography industry, or it's coming with biometric sensors that I expect will completely disrupt the healthcare industry over the next few years. So platform companies continue to invest in adjacent markets. And whether it's taking virtual reality beyond gaming into entertainment and media, or the atomization of technology and supply chains, Amazon bought Kiva Systems, a robotics company, in 2012. And by September of 2017, we have 100,000 robots in our fulfillment centers. And if you ever get a chance to go, I was able to tour one outside of Seattle. 3,000 people work there, 6,000 robots, and it's mind-blowing to go and look at these things and how they're driving innovation, transportation, e-commerce, blockchain. So wherever the next battleground is going to be, whether it's in cloud or enterprise or commerce or payments or virtual reality, software and platform companies are driving this type of creative destruction in many more fields beyond telecom, beyond photography, beyond healthcare. And no matter what you do, whether you're an entrepreneur, these companies buy technology. So if you can build and you can find a way to satisfy part of this as an entrepreneur, it can be very, very satisfying and lucrative. But no matter what you do, whether you're an entrepreneur or you work in corporate or you work as a farmer or you're in philanthropy, creative destruction is going to impact you. So the lessons learned, again, just to recap: protect the downside and the upside will take care of itself. The value of a job or career is much more about experience than how much money you make. Appropriately, professionally, and thoughtfully ask. Live intentionally and write down a bucket list, and you will be amazed at what you can accomplish. And then keep learning and be coachable. And I would submit, read The Economist. And a final reminder: even though creative destruction is an old economic term and concept, innovative entry by entrepreneurs is the disruptive force that sustains economic growth. And The Economist, again, if you haven't caught that yet, ran this 10-part series January through March of 2018 about 10 tips for fearless entrepreneurs that you may want to get your hands on and run with creative destruction. Learn it, transform it, accelerate it. Thank you. Yeah, I'm open for questions if there are any.
Yeah, we only have time for several questions too. And please stay after the questions because we have an announcement about next week.
Sure, hi. I'm sorry, one more time?
What's the most important thing
When innovating?
Yeah.
So the question is, what do you think are the most important things to consider when innovating? And I think that's a pretty broad question. But I think it's where can you have an impact? So if you are innovating, at Accenture we call this the tip of the spear. And it's true for innovating, it's true for new client relationships. I think it's true for a lot of areas of life. You're not going to make a big, huge change, but you can have a little impact. You can create a little entree in one part of the organization that's not working very well. And so how do you define the problem? And I've found that at the start of a consulting project or even with my teams today, I go slow to go fast. Go slow to go fast. And take time to actually define the problem that you're working on. And I think that will help you be more specific and intentional in terms of what you're trying to innovate. and what the opportunity might be, and go from there. Yeah.
Do you think it was a good decision or a bad decision for Amazon to pull out of New York? What are your thoughts on that?
So the question is, do I think it's a good decision or a bad decision for Amazon to pull out of New York? Boy, I have no idea, and I'll answer this as Paul, not Amazon, just to clarify, because I have no inside knowledge of this whatsoever. From my background and my education, I have a difficult time understanding some of the arguments for not having someone come in. I understand that people are concerned about jobs and growth and impacts on housing and things like that. I argue that there's a lot more upside in terms of having something like that come in and than not. And so I suspect that, I don't know, we'll see. Time will tell. I would have loved to have been in New York, and we love New York, and so it would have been interesting to go there. We'll see how it plays out over time. Sure thing. Yes?
Were you glad you finished the Boston Marathon?
Was I glad that I finished the Boston Marathon? I was. Wild horses could not have kept me from not finishing that race. And the weather, I don't know if you guys follow this at all, but the weather in Boston was actually worse than the weather in Antarctica. The weather in Boston last year, 4,000 people had medical attention. It was freezing rain. It was a 50-mile-an-hour gale force wind coming in off the ocean. It was horrible. It was absolutely horrible. So, yeah, I think it was worth it. I really do. I really do. Thanks. That's a good question. Yeah. Anyone? Yes?
What do you think are some of the main reasons those telecom companies didn't innovate when they were basically handed it on a silver platter?
So the question is, why do I think that some of those telecom companies didn't innovate? And I've struggled with this question for a long time, and we talked about it a little bit at the table before coming in here. You know, I think a lot of it is human nature. And you have people, very senior executives, who have been there for a long time, and they have huge remits, and they have organizations of thousands of people. And it is counterintuitive, or you need some people that are very, very brave to go after things like this. And you have people, and you have equipment, and you have processes, and it's very difficult. It's swimming upstream, and it takes bravery. And I think that there's not the appetite. It's too hard. And I think it requires too much change. And I think oftentimes people at that level in their career are a bit too complacent. And I wasn't able to identify those strong change agents within the companies that had that much political capital or bravery to actually make that change. And I think it signals an awfully dire warning for me looking at that industry. If they're not going to innovate, we've seen what happens to companies that don't innovate. And so, you know, I think we will probably see that for that part of the industry. Others will, and they will, their businesses will either adapt or go out of business.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Yes?
What's it like working at Amazon?
What's it like working at Amazon is the question. It's really, really cool. You know, I am exceptionally happy with Amazon. It's unlike any place I've ever worked or consulted for, and I've consulted for a lot of companies. The single biggest change for myself, as well as many other, particularly senior people that join, you know, I was in consulting for a long time, so you could give me a PowerPoint deck on anything, and I could present it. It didn't matter what the PowerPoint deck said, I could tell a story. But at Amazon, PowerPoint is outlawed. It's banned. It's banned, except in large public presentations, town hall meetings. So you walk into a meeting maybe with 30 people, and you can write a 6-page document, and then you can have 10 pages of appendices. But you walk into a meeting with 30 people and you sit down, and for this first 20 to 30 minutes, it's completely quiet, and everybody's reading. And then everybody's done reading, and then you debate. And it's very Socratic. And anybody can ask any question whatsoever. So you really have to know your stuff, and it's very, very dense. You can have financial information, and it's all written in a paragraph. And so that movement from kind of art to analytics and being able to digest information and as well as portray information that way is a really big change. And that's what trips most people up at Amazon. It's very, very analytical. And so that's the biggest change.
Awesome. Hey, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.